Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with William Dalrymple. William is one of Britain's great historians, and he is the best-selling author of The Quartet on the East Indian Trade Company. He wrote White Mughals, The Last Mughal, Return of a King, and his most recent book, The Anarchy, which has been shortlisted for many awards. And he won the 2020 Author Rose Bronze Medal from the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. He has been a broadcaster, which he's won a BAFTA for. He has been part of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's had fellowships at Princeton, Brown, and Oxford. He regularly writes for New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, The Guardian, and he is just well revered around the world. I was super excited to talk with him about his fabulous book, The Anarchy. And in many ways, in terms of chronology, this is the, if you will, the prequel to the other books that he wrote about the East India Company. And so he kind of lays out in the beginning of the conversation his quartet of books on the East India Company, where it resides. And in many ways, this conversation is a part one of hopefully 4 parts. I hope to get him on again at certain points to talk about the other 3 in the quartet, which would be a very nice, hopefully, compendium to the books. He talks about the origins of the East India Company, what the East India Company traded, and how they began to have a large influence in India. He talks about how they went from trading to overthrowing the Mughal Empire and ruling India, which is just a absolutely wild story. This is a story I did not know of, and I think it's maybe true for a lot of people in the West that are very uninformed about some of the history of India, but then also of Britain's involvement. We talk about how the East India Company dealt with famine and became semi-nationalized, and then how their demise and how they fell. And it took quite a long time, actually, for that to happen. William is such a delight to talk to. He's one of these people that, I'll ask him a question and he'll run with it, and he gives so much information. His mind is just brimming with information on this topic and many other topics, and he was just a real joy to talk to and tell us about the East India Company and its history. And I very much hope to have him on again in the future to talk about his other books and his other writing as well. And so now I bring you William Dalrymple. I'm here with William Dalrymple. Am I saying this right?
Dalrymple.
Exactly. There you go.
Want to get it really authentic.
It's my American coming out. It's so wonderful to have you. I'm very excited for the conversation. You have written a marvelous book, which I understand is a prequel to some other books. The book is called The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence in the Pillage of an Empire. But this is one of, or 4, I should say. So just tell us about, I guess, this book, and then how it fits within the other 3 that have been written.
Sure. So these are a quartet of books about the world's first multinational, the East India Company. And when I started writing these books 20 years ago, neither imperialism as a subject, nor indeed the subject of corporations were particularly things that people were talking about. Weirdly, 20 years later, when I published the 4th volume of this quartet, the 4th and final volume, I should say, of this quartet, both those subjects now seem to be incredibly important. Everyone's talking about empire. Everyone's talking about the, particularly I think in Britain, where people have been very slow to wake up to the fact that empire is necessarily predatory. That no one invades another country for that country's sake. Right. Putin is not thinking of the good people of Ukraine when he sits and with his eyes and sends his tank regiments into Kiev. Mm-hmm. Empires are built for the benefit of the empire builders, the imperialists. But the British have sort of somehow managed to convince themselves that their empire was different from other empires. It wasn't like the Belgians in the Congo or the the Nazi Reich or even the Germans in Sudetenland. That somehow it was a benign transfer of civilization that generously gave the gift of railways and civilization and so on to the natives. And a lot of Britons to this day still believe that. And bizarrely, and people often find this very difficult to believe, in the UK history curriculum, the British Empire simply doesn't appear. It's a kind of huge absence, an elephant in the room. But maybe not an elephant in the room in the sense that people, have just forgotten it. And the narrative that is taught to our kids in Britain is one where the Brits were always on the side of liberty and freedom. And first of all, we liberated the slaves. Then we sent sort of Florence Nightingale off to the Crimea, and then we fought against Hitler and defeated Hitler. And therefore this image is created that the Brits are there as guardians of freedom, and British politicians talk blithely about British values, by which they mean liberty, freedom, democracy, as if the British did not conquer a great chunk of the globe and subject the peoples all over the world to their rule for their own benefit. And this may sound ridiculous to an American, but I can assure you that the Brits have been incredibly slow to take in the full implications of their imperial history, and somehow conned themselves really into believing that this was a benign enterprise. So anyway, that is all beginning to, reality is beginning to dawn on a lot of people. Although there's also quite a fierce backlash of which this government is part, and it's accusing anyone that brings up the empire or slavery of being, in inverted commas, woke, and as if it's some sort of exercise in ridiculous political correctness to recognize that we looted and pillaged half the globe. Anyway, so that's one side of it. It's the story of empire, but it's and how empire emerged, not in the case of India from Downing Street or the Foreign Office or the British Army or the British Navy, but bizarrely from a company. A corporation that existed out of one office block in London, was run by a bunch of directors who sat around the boardroom, who had a share price, and existed for the shareholders, as any company does. In a sense, nothing wrong with that. But it is something wrong with that is when a trading company then starts turning into an imperial force and asset stripping in another country for the benefits of the shareholders, and that is not okay. And that's exactly what the East India Company did. So there's 4 books. You asked what they were. Chronologically speaking, The Anarchy is the first, although it was the last to be written. And that is the story of the founding of the East India Company, and it takes the story through to 1803, which is really the moment by which they'd taken over the Mogul Empire, which was the great empire which preceded it. They take Delhi in 1803, and that's where the book closes. The second volume is called White Mughals, published in the US by Holt. And that is a social history that does a bit of a deep dive from this sort of massive panorama in the Anarchy down to one couple, a mixed race couple, where a British diplomat called James Achilles Kirkpatrick falls in love with a Hyderabadi princess called Khairunisa. And he converts to Islam and effectively becomes a double agent working for the people of Hyderabad against the company. And what is spectacular about the story is that in the case of this one unique case, not only do all Kirkpatrick's almost daily letters to his brother in Calcutta survive, with all the intimate stuff in code, and the code is overwritten, some of the passages, so we can crack it and read his most personal details and his most intimate moments. But also, because it caused a huge scandal in Hyderabad, we actually have the records of the girl's family and an account from her side of the fence, including many documents from her and her family. So suddenly you move from this great panorama to one couple who are on the, if you like, the cutting edge of what it actually means personally. And of course, like all good love stories, it ends in tragedy. But it ends also with a rather remarkable sort of flip, because the 2 kids from the marriage who are brought up between these 2 worlds, initially with both Persian and British names, brought up as Shia Muslims in Hyderabad, speaking Persian, which is the court language, get sent back to England, where they're suddenly baptized and brought up as English kids after their father dies. And it's only 50 years later that the daughter manages to reconnect with her grandmother. And by this stage, she's an evangelical Christian living in Torquay, married to a British Army general. She's a great beauty, as her mother was, and has married a very senior officer in the British Army. But remembers, she was, I think, 7 when she went to England. So she has strong but hazy memories of an entire Indian childhood when she was a different religion and speaking a different language. In a sense, it's a kind of Pocahontas story, except Pocahontas manages to get back in touch with her family. And again, it all ends in tragedy, but I won't spoil the plot by telling you what exactly happens. The third volume is a volume which has suddenly got back into the British and Indian bestseller list this year because it's the story of the East India Company's failed attempts to take over Afghanistan. And what's so extraordinary about that story is that the man they put in, who is a man called Shah Mulk, who is a king that has previously ruled Afghanistan, has been toppled, and is then put back in again, is the direct forebear of Hamid Karzai. So the East India Company installed the same guy that the US installed in 2001. And he's brought down by the ancestors of the tribes that now make up the Taliban, the Ghilzai, particularly the Hotaki Ghilzai, lead the same assault on the same cities, in the same place, the place where the British cantonment in the 1820s was exactly where the American embassy now is. Literally the same side. And it was being shot at from the same hills. And both eventually, I mean, I predicted this. It wasn't, you didn't particularly need to have a crystal ball because it was all going badly wrong. But when it was published in 2013, I said, this is going to end in the same government, the Taliban coming back in the same way that they did in 1842. And of course, that's indeed what we saw unfold this summer, which was horrific. But a certain schadenfreude for the authors for having, in a sense, got a prediction right. Not that I say you needed a crystal ball to do it. And then finally, the fourth volume is called Last Mogul. It's published by Knopf, and it is the story of how this multinational company that by then controls the whole of India and has spread out massively from the southern tip of the coast to the Himalayas and everything in between, is brought down not by the uprising initially of the company's subjects, but by the revolt in its own army, a revolt that the British call the Indian Mutiny and the Indians call the First War of Independence. Both terms are slightly unsatisfactory in that it started off as a mutiny and became a wider revolt. So I use the term the Great Uprising. It was, in fact, the largest anti-colonial revolt in the world in the 19th century. And hundreds of thousands die. It's a complete mess, pillage and massacres and rape and horrors throughout. And it ends with the East India Company being effectively nationalized by the British Crown and its regiments and navy absorbed into the British Army and Navy, and its civil service absorbed into what became the Raj. And for the next 90 years, you get the famous British Raj, the thing we see in all those films like Passage to India or whatever, or Gandhi, all those women on croquet lawns floating along in crinoline glasses, and that more familiar form of empire, which is Queen Victoria, Lord Curzon, the British Crown running India. But for the first 250 years, there's something completely unfamiliar and completely weird, which is India run out of an office in London, in the city of London, by a corporation. And that is the story of the Anarchy, which is the book that's just come out in paperback and which we're talking about today.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic overview. I want to jump right into it, but just for listeners, just tell people your kind of a brief kind of overview of who you are. So obviously you're a historian. You're obviously well versed in all of this, but just tell us what you do and what you have been writing on and how you ended up in India.
So I'm speaking to you from Delhi. I live on a farm outside India, which is where I've lived for on and off for most of my adult life. And I am a Cambridge-trained historian. At different times, I've been a foreign correspondent, a photographer, but for the last 20 years, I've been writing history. These books have won a nice crop of awards across the board, and I'm now a fellow of the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. I've taught at Princeton and at Brown. And when I'm not doing my history books, I run the largest literary festival in the world, which is called the Jaipur Literature Festival, along with two Indian colleagues, Namita Gokhale and Sanjay Roy. But before, in the pre-pandemic world, we used to get about 500,000 people.
Wow.
It's like Glastonbury or Woodstock or something.
Wow.
And it's fantastic. It's free. It's all paid for by sponsorship, and the average age is about 21. So we have thousands of kids turning up and eagerly asking questions to everybody. Wow. So that's my other life. And as I said previously, long ago in my youth, a foreign correspondent. But anyway, now it's history and writing.
No, it's great. Obviously, you're a fantastic writer, and I think it's really nice. Actually, you have a nice balance of different things. It's not just academia. That's really great. So
I think it's very important to, in a sense, cross-fertilize your life. I think if you do just do your books and your writing, you can get stale. And it's very nice, the whole public nature of this festival and this enormous carnival that we throw every year. In the city of Jaipur. So it's very nice to frankly get out of it.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, I have similar things as well. I have a different world that I do. I do clinical work and therapy and so I do that. It's my day job, and so talking to awesome people is my night job of sorts. And then I have personal things that I'm really into, and so I think it is very nice to have a good balance of things, and they kind of complement each other. So that's great.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've already started to get into this, but I guess the first big question is you kind of give this overview of this idea of the East Indian Company is basically overthrows the Mughal Empire and rules it for the better part of 50 plus years. So you start in the beginning of the book with the kind of genesis, if you will, in 1599. And so I guess what were 1765, if I'm right, is when the East Indian Company kind of came to power. So I guess what was going on for those 166 years? If there was inklings all the way back into this, late 16th century, why did it take to the middle of the 18th century to kind of get there?
So the East India Company starts off as a normal trading company, but not normal in the sense that it is really one of the very first joint stock companies. Today, the world is full of companies where the shares are controlled by a variety of people. People buy and share them. There's a sell price, and we take that for granted as a normal part of business life. But it's something that, like everything else in the world, was invented, and it happened to be invented in Tudor England. The first joint stock company is the Muscovy Company, which is invented early in the reign of Elizabeth to trade with Moscow and to trade furs and so on. Then there is the much darker story of the Royal Africa Company, which was a slaving company, among other things, but principally a slaving company, which the British Crown invested heavily in, which was responsible for many of the horrors of slavery. And then in 1599, a group of Dutch businessmen arrive in India a group of Dutch businessmen arrive in London and try to start buying up ships. The reason being that they've just successfully sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and brought tons of spices back from the East Indies, which is what we today call Indonesia, islands like Run and off the coast of Sumatra, this sort of area. And lots of Brits, lots of English, actually, we should say, rather than Brits, because England is not a part of Britain at that point; it's its own country. Lots of English merchants get their backs put up by this. Why should we sell the Dutch shipping? We should be doing this ourselves. And a man called Thomas Smythe convenes a public meeting in a hall called Moorgate Fields, and he persuades a lot of the richest men in London to put up money to found a company of London merchants trading to the East Indies. And we have the original subscription list. It's still in the British Library. It's people that range from the Lord Mayor, who puts £1,000 in, to ordinary vintners, haberdashers, leather workers, and so on, who put in £5, £10. And this is something new. Up to then, you had things like guilds, which might represent, all the merchants selling wool in East Anglia, for example, and they might club together and go off to the Low Countries and buy some looms or sell some wool. But it is just a bunch of merchants together. What's different about the joint stock is that anyone can invest. You don't have to be in the wool trade. You don't have to be in any other trade. You just put in your money, and you get to share the profits if there are any, or you take a hit on the losses if they occur. And this is not quite a brand new idea, but it's an idea that's only 50 years old. When the company is founded in 1599. This is the London of Shakespeare. Shakespeare is writing Hamlet the same time that the East India Company is founded. And the first voyage takes off. It's a bit of a voyage in the dark. And the people who make up the cruise are really, the ship is telling. They go to the shipyard and they reject a creaky old hulk called the Mayflower that's sitting there for sale, which obviously goes in a different voyage in a different direction shortly afterwards. But instead, they buy a pirate ship called the Scourge of Malice. And being good businessmen, they realize this is not a very promising name for a trading company. So they promptly changed the name to the Red Dragon, as if it's a nice pub on a Welsh lane or something. And off they sail. And a lot of the sailors are literally pirates. They're privateers, which is a relatively respectable profession in Tudor England, because the Portuguese and the Spanish are sending treasure from the New World mines back home, and Drake and Raleigh and all these people get licenses from the crown to raid it. These are the enemies of England, and they are Catholic. England is Protestant, and a lot of the sailors who happen to be out of work at this point sail up for this expedition. And when they reach the East Indies, they didn't even land, because they find a Portuguese ship coming in the opposite direction. They know exactly what to do. They board it, and they just simply transfer the contents of the vessel into their own hold, sail back to London, and sell it for £1 million. That is literally what happens. £1 million is paid for the spices that they take from this Portuguese carrack. And that starts off a business which is basically involved in selling spices. That's the original conception of the East India Company, that they'll sail around the world to Indonesia. They'll buy cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, all these items, which normally come with a terrific markup, because they pass from Indonesia to India, India to the Arabs, Arabs to the Venetians usually, and then by the time they've arrived in Northern Europe, they're more expensive than gold dust. But this is now, a brilliant way of cutting that. You go straight to the producers in the East Indies, or better still, you rob the Portuguese in the East Indies, and you sail home and sell it. But the original competitors, the Dutch, are doing it better. Holland is a new nation. This is the golden age of the Netherlands. Rembrandt and all that sort of stuff is beginning to kick off. And the Dutch have got far more sophisticated financial instruments than the English at this stage. They have better ways of raising capital, and they can buy bigger boats, better captains, and so on. And by about 1640, 40 years on, the English have a clash with the Dutch. The Dutch basically kick the ass of the East India Company, and a deal is done when, famously, as a kind of sop to the English crown, the Dutch hand over in exchange for these incredibly valuable spice islands that the English have to evacuate, having lost the war. As a sop, they are given a muddy island in the Hudson River called Manhattan, which is how New York ending up in British hands for a while. Anyway, 1640, on this defeat, the company realizes that basically they're going to move out of the spice trade. They've got to redesign their business model. And only at this stage do they focus on India, which becomes the new center of operations. And they basically abandon the spice trade in the East Indies and take up the textile trade in India. And this is a good timing, because in 1640, the Mughal Empire is at its peak. Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, is on the throne. And while, we tend to associate the Mughals who built the Taj Mahal with sort of pleasure and lying around dropping sort of mangoes in the mouths of beautiful princesses and all that sort of stuff, all this, like all empires, is built on a solid economic base, which is mainly about the textile trade. But the Mughals, being Central Asian nomads in origin, do not have a navy. They are very much a land power. And so this leaves the possibility for the Dutch, the Portuguese, the English, the French, the Danes, the Swedes, and much everyone else that's got shipping and ambition to arrive in India, buy textiles very cheaply. And these range from very expensive silks and incredibly sophisticated embroideries through to simple, beautifully made, but very cheap cotton cloth. And this they ship around the world. And, quite soon, for example, you get deindustrialization in Mexico because of the sheer quantity of amazingly good quality, cheap cotton that's being imported by the company. And this still goes on very well and very profitably for both sides until the Mughal Empire begins to fall apart in about 1700. Mughal Empire, I should say, and I haven't said this yet, is the richest empire in the world at this point. It controls not only all of modern India, but modern Pakistan, Bangladesh, quite a bit of Afghanistan, south of Kabul. Kabul is the northern capital of the Mughal Empire. And many people spend their summers up there, a little chunk of Iran. So this is a vast empire, and it produces about 40% of the world's GDP, particularly the eastern side of India and Bengal, where there are about 1 million weavers. So it's an extraordinarily profitable place, and the empire begins to crack up due to its own internal tensions, particularly at the fact that the Mughals are largely Muslim and the population of India is largely Hindu. And so you get a bunch of insurgencies, often based on fairly sharp religious lines, particularly led by a man called Shivaji, who leads his Maratha troops against the Mughals. They take the whole of central India. Meanwhile, the Sikhs in the Punjab in the north are restive too, and they're converging on Delhi. The other capital, Agra, is threatened by a group of farmers called the Jats. And so the whole thing is falling apart, and no one knows whether Delhi, this ripe mango in the middle, which again is 1 million people, it's the largest urban space between Constantinople and Edo, Tokyo. No one knows whether it's going to fall to the Marathas, the Sikhs. It's clearly not going to survive very long. But no one expects it to fall to who it does fall to, which is the Persians. And the Persians march in unexpectedly in 1739. There's a military genius called Nader Shah. He has invented something called the swivel gun, which is this sort of armor-piercing artillery that the Mughals have no conception can go straight through their armor, and they're taken completely by surprise at the Battle of Karnal, when a relatively small Persian force makes mincemeat of a massive, unrambling Mughal army, of which there are about 1 million people in the camp. But on the field, probably about 300,000, and the Persians defeat them very heavily. Then they capture the Mughal emperor and march him into Delhi. A month later, they leave, and they take with them his greatest gemstones that all the Mughals have been busy plundering and looting for the previous 100 years. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, now in the Queen Mother's crown in London, the Peacock Throne, which is the most expensive jeweled object ever made, and 8,000 wagons of gold and jewels just get shipped up to Persia. And overnight, it's as if, imagine you have a great Baroque mirror and you throw it out a third-story window, just smash it in a million pieces. That's what happens to the Mughal Empire. There's no money to pay the soldiers, there's no money to pay the civil service, and the whole thing just dissolves. So where you had a single, very powerful, very rich unitary state based on one dynasty in the north, suddenly you have 1,000 small city-states doing their own thing, fighting with each other or making alliances or whatever. And the people who hoover up are these two new European trading companies. The British, or rather English East India Company, based out of Calcutta, but also with centers in Bombay and Madras, and the French East India Company, based out of Pondicherry. And there's a lot of rivalry, and both these new forces introduce totally new methods of European warfare. In Europe, you've just had Frederick the Great reinventing the whole way of fighting a battle. Up to, for centuries, it's been about cavalry and armor and all this sort of thing. Frederick the Great puts into the field infantry armed with muskets and bayonets and supported by horse artillery. And these guys make mincemeat of Pompa's cavalry armies. Often they're highly trained peasants. They're not, the elite of the aristocracy. These are ordinary people who've been trained to drill, to fire in files. Remember, those movies when you see those guys, one lot on their knees firing while the guys behind loading their rifle. It's that kind of stuff. But that's invented. Again, this is something which is invented. It's invented by Frederick the Great. And these two European companies introduce these new ways of fighting to India. And as in Europe, they find that anyone that has this technology and this training can make mincemeat of huge Indian cavalry armies. And for 40 years, the two companies fight amongst each other. And then eventually the French get knocked out and the English continue. And what's the clever trick that the East India Company plays is that virtually none of the people doing the fighting are their own people. What they do is that they borrow money from Indian bankers who are very pleased to find a group of merchants who understand the idea of loans and repayment on time and commercial contracts. And the company may be scamsters in a whole rich variety of ways and looters and plunderers and so on, but they know to value a commercial contract, they know to repay on time and how to calculate interest. So Indian bankers support these guys, lend them money, and they buy vast mercenary armies. By 1800, the East India Company army is 200,000 men, while the British army is only 100,000 men. It is literally exactly double the size.
Wow.
And this is controlled by a skeleton staff. When the first big battle, the Battle of Plassey, is fought in 1756, there are still only 250 white executives in Calcutta.
Wow.
And at the same, well, not quite there, but 100 years of the East India Company's history, there are only 35 people in the head office. Yet the skeleton staff pull off this extraordinary coup of borrowing vast sums of money, building up an enormous mercenary army of Indians, and sending them off to fight other Indians, and then just reaping the profits. And they, in the early days of the company, when they were a normal trading company, there was a very simple business model. You brought out lots of gold from London in the bottom of a ship. You turned it into coin or gold, and you bought textiles or spices or saltpeter or whatever you were after, and ship it back to London and sell it for more. Now that you have conquered a great chunk of India, it's much easier. You just tax the Indians, and with the profits of that, you buy gold. Sorry, you buy textiles, saltpeter, and spices, and then you ship it back, having paid nothing for it, and sell it still for a great profit. So the East India Company becomes this massively profitable operation, onto which they then add a whole new thing, which is they turn into a massive narco operation. They start growing opium in Bihar, producing industrial quantities of the equivalent of heroin. This is raw opium, which they sell to the Chinese at vast profits. They fight 2 opium wars to gain the rights to do this, and they then sell the tea in India, in Europe, and in America. And this is, of course, East India Company tea, which is dumped in Boston Harbor at the beginning of the American Revolution, because the tea tax, which is also raised by the British government to try and help the East India Company, which is going through a financial wobble. So this story, which may sound very far away and exotic, actually has a very important dynamic onto American history and the American Revolution.
I noticed those kind of cameos that make their appearance in the book, and it's interesting to just kind of see the far reaches of the kind of tentacles of the East India Company. It's interesting listening to you lay it out very well. Is how there was this, it sounds like in the beginning, this impact of the Spanish and Dutch empires, right? That they were, back when they were in the Indies, that was the folks that were kind of the competition. And so then going from spices to textiles in India, I guess the question I have is how did the East Indian Company go from, okay, we're going to do, certain types of, trading. And in some ways, I think you say somewhere in the book that it kind of not invented, but it was a big force in corporate lobbying at a certain point, right? How did it go from that? So you described the kind of certain factions that were going on in India, right? And so there was a little bit of disharmony of sorts. And so then, okay, how did they go from, okay, we're going to hire a bunch of mercenaries, we're going to, tax a bunch of folks about how we're doing the trading, to then trying to take over the entire country and then fight other empire? Like, how does a trading company go from okay, we're just going to do some of these trades to control an entire country, and then we're taking out the whole entire empire? How did we get from just the trading bit to like running the entire country essentially?
So it all starts, I suppose, with, well, I should say, first of all, that the original East India Company charter in 1599 gives them the right to wage war and gives them the right to found colonies. So it's always implicit that that the company is not going around with on its knees begging for trade. It's this is, as all trading companies in those days were, was an armed trade which defended itself against pirates and aggressors. And this is not unique, of course, to the East India Company. At the same time this is going on, the Virginia Company is colonizing Virginia. The Hudson Bay Company is looking for furs and so on up in Canada, and so there's a whole range of different corporations that are involved in the proto-colonial activity at this period. But the way in which it suddenly moves from being an armed trading company to being a fully fledged colonial force happens by chance. And I suppose if you had to pick a moment when it begins to change, it starts rather like the Iraq War with the dodgy dossier. In the case of the Iraq War, there was a lot of flim-flam about yellow cake and how the Iraqis were supposedly arming to use weapons of mass destruction, all of which turned out to be nonsense in the end. In the same way, this whole story begins with a spy's report, which I've seen in the National Archives in India and got out.
And so how we get to this process of they start this way of saying, okay, we're going to do these trades, but then we're going to start taking it. So you were talking about how they have this kind of dossier of sorts of saying like, well, you could, kind of like in the Iraq War, there was some aspect of the spice piece. So just tell us about how that kind of set things off.
So as with the Iraq War, this all begins with a dodgy dossier. In the case of the Iraq War, it's the full story that the Iraqis are trying to turn yellow cake, import yellow cake and turn it into nuclear fissile material. In the case of the East India Company, there is a spies report which I've seen in the Indian National Archives, and it tells the story of how the French are planning to send a massive fleet to India to take over the British interests in India, or the company's interests in India. And there is a very graphic description of this guy looking over the port and seeing all the different ships being loaded with cannon and ammunition. He counts the different bores of the cannon, the different numbers of the cannons being loaded aboard. And you get this impression of this enormous battle fleet ready to go and do mischief with the East India Company in India. The trouble is that, as with the dodgy dossier in the case of Iraq, they've got the wrong end of the stick. And in actual fact, this fleet is off to Canada to fight what you guys call the French and Indian Wars. All that sort of, last of the Mohican stuff with Daniel Day-Lewis jumping over waterfalls with beautiful girls in white dresses following, all that stuff. They're not going anywhere near India. And so when the company persuades the British Navy to send a task force of Marines out to ambush the French, they arrive halfway across the world after a voyage of 6 months to find there's no French fleet to be seen. And they're all feeling a bit silly until a day later, they hear the news that Calcutta has fallen, not to the French, but to a local Indian ruler, a man called Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who was the Nawab of Bengal. And this is pure ill fortune for the Siraj Dowlah and pure good fortune for the British. They'd never sent out a battle fleet before. This is the first, and it happened to be around when this massive onslaught to Calcutta was engineered by Siraj Dowlah, and so, rather than kicking their heels in Madras or going back home, they go up to Calcutta, they retake it. And at that point, the commander, who's a man called Robert Clive, receives a letter from a local banker called the Jugget Set. Now, Jugget Set means the banker to the world, and he is just that. He is this incredibly powerful banker who has already played in politics and installed Siraj Dowlah's grandfather a generation earlier. As the governor of Bengal. And now he thinks that, quite rightly, that Siraj Dowlah is psychotic and a problem, and he's wrecking business in the region by attacking the company, which is a major source of finance for the bankers. So he offers £1 million to Clive to get rid of Siraj Dowlah, and another £1 million to the company if he does it. So Clive says, without checking with anyone, sure. He's come halfway across the world. It's his big moment to try and make his name. And he says, sure. And he attacks Siraj Dowlah. The main general on the battlefield facing him is also in the pay of the bankers, so just walks off when halfway through the action, leaving the governor to his fate. The governor is duly killed. Clive marches into the capital, Murshidabad, into the treasury, and simply stuffs his pockets with all the jewels and the goodies in there, and then stuffs 40 boatloads with the jewels and the treasure left over. And this is the beginning of British fortunes completely changing in India from that point. They become a colonial power. They start installing puppet rulers, what we today call regime change, to suit them, and they form this alliance with these very powerful bankers who continue to support them rather than Indian rulers for their own interests throughout the rest of the company period. So it starts fairly slowly, and 10 years later there's another big war. Again, another Mughal governor in Bengal rises against the company, this time with, however, the Mogul Emperor and the very powerful governor of the next big Mughal governorate, which is called Awadh. So 3 Mughal armies converge, attack the Brits, and again they're defeated by what is now a very professional sepoy army of about 20,000 highly trained troops using these very sophisticated new methods of fighting. And suddenly the company finds that it's got control of all the richest areas of India. So with the Mughal emperor in their pocket, they force him to sign a treaty which hands over the economic management of the 3 richest states in this, the richest kingdom in the world, to their economic management. It's rather like, I suppose, imagine if, I don't know, Putin took over California and demanded that Silicon Valley be turned over to Russian businessmen, something like that. And Bihar, Bengal, and Orissa are then managed by the company from 1765. There's a document called the Diwani, which is signed by the emperor. And you have this bizarre situation where still a private company, still run from a single, very small office, just 5 windows wide.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book about how the first building or whatever of the East Indian Company was very humble. You wouldn't even recognize it. You wouldn't know that, basically at a certain point the entire country is being run from just this office or whatever.
Continent.
It's incredible.
And they then do what, in a sense, any big capitalist organization would do in this situation. They basically asset strip it, to use a modern term. And for the next 10, 15, 20 years, the Brits, individual Brits, are sending back £1 million on retirement. And suddenly you're finding England, which up to this point was, a very marginal economic player in Europe. There were none of the big palaces on the scale of Versailles. There was none of the riches that you find in Renaissance Italy. None of the money you find in Spain or Portugal pouring in from the New World. And suddenly all over England, you have these enormous Palladian houses turning up. Most of them are paid for by the East India Company. Those that aren't tend to be paid for by the slave trade. So this is the moment when Britain turns from this marginal player on the edge of Europe, looking enviously at Italy, the way that all Shakespeare's plays are about, Verona and Venice and so on. The Brits are very much looking over their shoulders at where the real action is over in the continent. But now suddenly England is a place where swaggering guys own enormous estates, and this is suddenly England's moment in the sun, with money sent back from asset stripping Mughal India. And so bad is this asset stripping that only within a decade of the signing of this document, the Diwani, there is the most terrific comeuppance for the company, because effectively they kill the goose which has laid this incredible golden egg. In this case, what has happened is that there is a famine. Now, famine is very common in India because everything is dependent on the monsoon, and it's a very regular occurrence in pre-modern India that the monsoon will fail for one reason or another, and a great chunk of the country won't get watered. So there's this system in place whereby any sensible ruler builds granaries and puts a little bit aside in fat years for the lean years. But the company, that is all about immediate profits and share price, has not done this, and moreover doesn't feel it's its duty to do it. So when this famine breaks out, a third of Bengal starves to death. The same famine takes place upstream, and the Mogul Emperor, builds soup kitchens, and his governors organize work programs to build enormous public buildings, and people are given a pittance and kept alive. But the company, a third of the population of Bengal just dies. And the company reacts by sending out its sepoys, its armed soldiers, into the fields, and they make everyone pay full taxes, despite the fact they're starving to death. And so on top of all the corpses lying around dying of starvation, you now have gibbets with people that haven't paid their taxes hanging from them. So it's a horrific scene. And this is not sustainable, clearly. And 2 years later, the company initially thinks that they can just extract taxes at the point of a bayonet. And the first year they do this, and the shareholders are so pleased to have a full tax that they vote themselves an increased dividend from 10 to 12.5%. An incredible act of sort of corporate greed and folly. But by 2 years later, everyone is can't pay the taxes at all. The weavers are dead. Everything is in a complete mess, and the company's share price falls dramatically. In fact, there's a run on the banks, and the first bank to go is the Ayr Bank, which is a Scottish bank based out of the west of Scotland, and then they go like dominoes. One after another company that's relied on East India Company dividends fails, and there is a major financial crisis. It's very like the subprime 10 years ago. With the difference that, unlike Lehman Brothers, the East India Company genuinely is too big to fail, because half the British economy depends on it. It's half of British exports, and there are millions of people building ships and making sails and sailors and what have you. So what happens is the company effectively is semi-nationalized. It becomes a public-private partnership, and about 50% of the shares are bought by the Crown. And from that point, the company changes from being a sort of libertarian free enterprise, a flagship of corporate freedom, to become increasingly a state-run activity. The state reserves the right to appoint the Governor General, and increasingly it becomes run out of the British imperial system. And it's only in 1858, when this great uprising breaks out, that the final vestiges of the private company is rolled out, and the company is nationalized in 1858 in Allahabad Fort, which is the same place where the Diwani was signed, really kicking off this chapter in 1756.
It's interesting how the rise of the company at that space was. I remember reading in the book of, you had these three armies that were coming together to defeat the company. And because they had built all these mercenaries, in fact, ended up winning and then taking over. But the reign of the East Indian Company seems to be one of taxation, one of people getting, stuffing their own pockets, and then people dying. And then it's all partly because of the famine, but then not taking care of people, obviously, which is incredible in a way, which is, how that could be done.
It's a very black and white image of colonialism. As I say, there's still people in Britain today who like to tell you how the British Empire was all about helping the natives to help themselves and all this sort of stuff. It's very nice just pointing them to East India Company history because no one has ever pretended that the company was ever about anything except making a profit. There was no corporate responsibility. There was no feeling that this was anything other than lining the pockets of the employees and the directors and the shareholders. And this they do very well. It's a terrific organ of wealth generation, but it does so at the expense of India, which has turned from the richest country in the world to, by the time the British finally leave in 1947, 200 years later, into one of the poorest countries in the world. Wow. What you see now in India, of course, is India beginning to return. It's not quite done what China has done yet. We haven't seen India return to the premier place in the world economy, and there's still a lot of poor people in India, but it's growing fast. And within our lifetimes, we will see India's economy expand in the way I'm sure that China is now doing.
Yeah.
There we go.
So I think the other thing about this is that there's this huge bailout, right? Because you were talking about this kind of semi-nationalized piece of it, and then there's this guy Warren Hastings that was there, and he was governing the whole bit of it after Clive had been gone. And so how do you start to see then? Okay, they're semi-nationalized, and then they start to fall, and the fall is like a very drawn out kind of thing, right? Because we're talking now in 1776, 1774, whatever it is, and then it doesn't happen until 1850 something or 1870. So we're talking 80, 100 years till really the dissolution of it. So how do we see that fall happening, where the Mughal Empire or Imperium tries to come back to take back Delhi, and how are they trying to work towards kind of splintering this apart?
So the Mogul Empire, you're quite right, is still sort of alive, though far from healthy, in Delhi. And there is a young man called Shah Alam, who I sort of very much set up as, I suppose, as the antithesis of Clive. Clive, the guy that fought the Battle of Plassey, Robert Clive, known to generations of British schoolboys as Clive of India, the hero of Plassey, is an extraordinarily ruthless villain who, like all good villains, has a terrific ability to size up an enemy and continually calls things right. He's a very effective street fighter. He attacks from behind. He attacks at night. He attacks during the middle of thunderstorms. You never know when Robert Clive is coming for you. While Shah Alam, who is the Mughal emperor and the legitimate ruler of most of India, is this sort of incredibly civilized, sweet-natured poet. He writes poetry in 5 languages. He's incredibly good-looking. He's very elegant. Clive is a kind of brute. But Shah Alam loses as many battles as Clive wins. And one of the tropes in the book, I suppose, is that Clive is the essence of sort of clumsy, venal, mercantile greed, while Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor, is this very attractive, charming poet prince who tries to recover his family throne. He's rather like sort of Prince Caspian that in the Narnia books. We first meet him as a young man escaping from Delhi because he's been overthrown by a rival, and he goes out into the countryside and rallies the people and tries to recover the greatness of his throne. But it doesn't work. History is in the opposite direction. The Mughals are never going to come back. And in the end, Shah Alam is blinded by a man called Ghulam Qadir with his own bare hands. There is this terrible scene of violence, and Shah Alam ends as this broken man, this blind emperor of an illusory empire that's just kept going by the company as a sort of stamp of authority to cover its own venal activities. And the company has two things which never fail it. One is the support of the bankers, so an unlimited stream of capital. It can spend money and raise money very quickly when it needs a navy or a task force or an army. And it has consistently better fighting force with the latest military technology. And these two things mean that it can defeat all these slightly chivalrous and well-meaning but ill-fated Indian armies that just simply don't have the same resources. So one by one, taking each enemy one at a time, the company advances slowly around the chessboard, knocking out each of its rivals. And the last to go is the Mogul Emperor, who is captured effectively for the second time in 1803 and kept as a one poet describes him as a chessboard king of no power, just there as a to cover the East India Company's activities with a veil of authority.
What would you say were the major contributions to the demise of the East Indian Company? So obviously you have Hastings impeached in 1788. There was an interesting bit there of Edmund Burke coming in. I did not expect to see Edmund Burke during this impeachment kind of hearing and everything. That was a very interesting cameo of sorts, if you will. But it sounds like this was important.
And Sheridan, the playwright Sheridan turned up. I mean, all sorts of people turn up in this, but Washington comes in. So what happens is that the East India Company is rather like Wall Street hedge fund managers in the 1980s. Everyone in Britain is slightly resentful and envious of these guys who are making dodgy money hand over fist and doing the equivalent of driving their Porsche into restaurants. And so there is a growing movement in Britain to try and bring the company to heel. In particular, what people resent, the politicians resent, is that a lot of these company magnates returning from India with vast fortunes spend them on buying rotten boroughs, corrupt parliamentary seats, and then forming an interest in Parliament. So the East India Company is, we've talked so far about how they've taken on the Mughals and they're the enemy of the Indians, but the East India Company, like a very clever multinational today, insinuates itself into the government of the country and has many people paid to look after its interests. You have, as early as 1690, 100 years in the history of the company, the very first case of corporate bribery, when the East India Company is caught simply giving money to MPs to bribe them to extend the East India Company's monopoly on trade with the East. The governor ends up in the Tower of London. Again, not an unfamiliar feeling today with all sorts of one particular businessman at the moment under the scanner for dodgy tax returns and so on. But then the company goes on to effectively invent corporate lobbying. And the company realizes that with enough MPs in Parliament, it can form basically its own party. So all these other MPs join the Tories or the Whigs. But when it comes to the company, they vote as a bloc to protect the interests of the company and protect their shares. On top of which, half the MPs in Parliament anyway have East India Company shares and are after the company's interests. So the company does what, I suppose what's your National Rifle Association or, it's a similar thing, it's a very well-organized lobbying group that can marshal parliamentary might when it needs it. To get laws passed to help it. And so in that sense, it's a precursor to all the stuff we've seen in the 20th century, where, for example, in the 1950s, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is about to be nationalized by Mossadegh, the first democratically elected Persian prime minister, Iranian prime minister. The CIA and MI6 mobilize, and they bring about a coup. They bring the Shah back to power with their backing, and Mossadegh is put in prison, and the nationalization never takes place. 2 years later, United Fruit in Guatemala sound the alarm bell because they're about to be nationalized because they own 60% of the farmland in Guatemala. The CIA bring about a coup, the government falls, and the term Banana Republic is born. 1977, ITT in Chile, similar stuff. And Allende is brought down by the CIA, and replaces him. So, this is all very familiar stuff today. But what's interesting about these Indian companies, this is happening 200 years ago. And so they're not only a militarized company. I think, I don't know, Google with fighter jets, or Tesla not with moon rockets, but with ICBMs. But equally, they have weaponized parliamentary lobbying, and they can control the legislature of the country. So for the first time in history, you see this battle that exists in every democracy between the power of the state and the power of the corporation. I live in India, where the big corporations have very much been behind the rise of the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and the Tatas and the Adanis and various other corporate interests, Reliance and so on, have been very strongly backing this right-wing government for their own interests. This happens in one way or another in many, many countries, perhaps in all democracies. Perhaps it's one of the, it's in a sense the fatal flaw of democracy, that corporations can wield power over the state. What's interesting about the story of the East India Company is that the state ultimately wins in this case. But who knows today whether we'll be so lucky in our generation to see Tesla or Google or Microsoft
That's right.
brought to heel.
That's right. Yeah, I think it is. Again, it just shows the supreme importance of understanding and knowing history, because this is kind of a cliche, but history does repeat itself, or there are so many similar themes throughout history, right? In different parts of the world, right? And I guess the common denominator there is, human greed and lust and desire, etc. But, you see this in,
human vices remain the same throughout history.
Right. And it's interesting though how it does follow these kind of similar patterns of, well, there's opportunity, and if we can, scam somebody over, we'll do it. And but doing it at a large scale, and where a lot of people are impacted is awful. In the book, you talk about 1792 as a major turning point for the East Indian Company in India. What was that? And then kind of just you sort of done a little bit, but there was a last stand in 1803, and then we get to 1833, where Parliament is trying to take the rights to trade, and then it finally dissolves in 74. So just kind of marches through the tail end of it, of the East Indian Company.
Sure. So the company, when it nearly went bankrupt in 1774, does this deal with the state, and it's bailed out by the crown. And from that point, the crown has the right to control who's the governor, governor general, who's in charge. But you continually find that there's a dissonance between what the company wants from London and what the guys on the ground want. And the reason for this is that the company makes most profits when there is peaceful trade, and the company manages to trade peacefully. The guys in India make most money when they get to go to war, attack rich cities and loot it. And it's not unique to the East India Company. The rules of war in the 18th century is that if a country or a city peacefully surrenders, you can't loot it. But if they resist, you can. And in 1799, they attack Tipu Sultan, who's this most violent, courageous, and effective resistance that you get against the company. And he's fought 3 wars against the East India Company, beaten the company hollow a couple of times, which no other Indian rulers succeeded in doing in quite the same manner. But in 1799, he is finally taken out. And it looks like there's no one else left other than the Marathas. Then there's a series of campaigns in 1803 against these warlords who had originally brought down the Mogul Empire, but they again are too divided among themselves to mount a proper resistance. And the young Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, earns his first spurs fighting the Marathas. And he says late in life that he was much more effective fighters than Bonaparte and Napoleon, that the Marathas gave him a far more trouble. But in the end, the force which brings down the company is its own mercenary army. All these battles are fought not with white troops imported from England, although there are a few officers. They're fought with Indian soldiers who are trained in India by a handful, a skeleton staff of white officers. And eventually, this obviously, the sepoys realized their own strength. And in 1857, they rise up. Why? Because of rumors of mass conversions to Christianity. The story has got out that this is now evangelical Christianity is at its peak in England. The officers of the army have now started reading sermons to the sepoys on parade. That some of them put out the 10 Commandments outside their command control posts. And this is the point that the East India Company introduces a new rifle, the Lee Enfield. This is after the company's been heavily defeated by Afghan troops with fantastic sniper rifles, the Jazail in Afghanistan. So they introduced the new rifle. Unfortunately, they don't, with their characteristic insensitivity, they coat the cartridges with a mixture of pig fat and cow fat, which is unclean both to Hindus and to Muslims. And the drill is that they have to bite the cartridge, pour the contents in, then ram it down with a ram. But through partly a kind of industrial fault, these cartridges are smeared with far too much fat, and that fat is offensive to the religious sensibilities of all Indians.
Sure, yeah.
And so they simply refuse to bite the bullet. That's where the phrase "bite the bullet" comes from. They refuse to bite the top of these things off because it's unclean. Those that refuse get marched off to prison, even if they're war heroes who fought for the company for their entire lives. And this causes the company's own army to rise in revolt. And out of 139,000 troops in the East India Company's Bengal army, 100,000 go to Delhi, put the Mughal emperor back on the throne. And for 6 months, it looks like Mughal rule is going to return. It's been moribund for 100 years now, but it finally looks as if the tables are turning, and there's massacres of British men and women and children all over India. And it's very difficult to see how it can have any outcome other than the company being thrown out of India once and for all. But the company has the telegraph, and enough warnings get out. The telegraph line has just been laid, and the warnings get out in time to particularly the north, to the Punjab, and the sepoys are disarmed. New troops are raised from what's now Waziristan, back at the same place that the Americans were drone bombing only a decade ago. And through the disunity of the sepoys, the fact they couldn't get their act together properly, they weren't properly officered, the company manages to retake Delhi and destroy the rebellion. Terrible human rights abuses. Hundreds of thousands of people are massacred and killed. The company is incredibly vindictive. They believe wrongly that many British women have been raped. And so terrible atrocities. Sepoys are sewn up in pigskins. They're blown from the mouth of cannons. There are revolting scenes. And this is such a mess and so bad for Britain's image that Parliament just rolls up the company. And in 1858, it is dissolved. And the Raj begins. So all that stuff one normally associates with the British and India, Queen Victoria, Lord Curzon, Kipling, all that sort of stuff kicks off in 1858. But it's only 90 years. By 1947, Gandhi and Nehru have rolled up the Raj and India is independence. The longest period of British rule in India is in fact the 250 years of the East India Company, from 1600 to 1858, when literally India is run from a private office block in the city of London. it's an extraordinary and terrible moment in history. I mean, of all the many regimes in history one would not like to live under, I think the East India Company's rule of India is very near the top of the list.
Again, it even after reading the book and hearing you talk about it, it's just astounding to me how that is the case and how that's happened. I guess the final question I have here is I guess somewhat sort of a compound question here is, I guess, what are the biggest things that we can learn from the East Indian Company's rule, and how does that impact India today? Because as you just stated, it was one of the longest ruling, companies of sorts, the kind of regimes in India. And India is one of the largest countries in the world in terms of people. I mean, it's 1.3 billion or whatever it is, and it's a large country, and it's got so many different people groups and sects and all these things. And it's an enormous place with so many different folks. What is the the ripple effects of the East India Company, and how does it impact current day, modern day India now?
So the lessons are not just for India. I mean, I suppose there are two lessons. One is that beware of corporations bearing gifts.
Sure. Yes.
Keep your companies well regulated. And this is, a real worry today when, the United States has got, a bunch of 10 companies that have larger incomes than most of the nation states of the world.
That's right.
The turnover of ExxonMobil or Walmart or Tesla or Amazon, Microsoft, Apple are larger than the GDPs of Europe. They are vast wealth, never mind Africa or anywhere else in the world. And with these enormous wealth comes enormous power. And in the story of the East India Company, eventually the nation state wins. But are we? Who knows what 50 years from now, the power of any of these corporations already. Elon Musk is aiming at outer space. Where is that going to lead? Who knows? And you could argue that companies today don't need the armies that the East India Company had, because they already have lobbying groups that trim the foreign policies of states to their advantage. Also, the degree to which data harvesting and so on gives enormous power to anyone that's read books on the power of data harvesting and the ways in which companies can read our emails and use our data to spy on us. It's very frightening. Anyone listening to this podcast with their mobile on is likely to get East India Company tea adverts in their social media feed the next day. They don't need to invade you anymore. They're already in your head. They're already in your computer, in your mobile phone. Certainly. So the lesson is not just for India, but in the case of India, many people in India today have been making. There've been many cartoons that the current right-wing government of Narendra Modi is beholden to large corporate interests. There's been a big fight this year in India about the farmers, because the farmers were being dragooned into a law which gave a lot of power to large corporations to buy their produce at fixed prices, which was going to impoverish them. And remarkably, the farmers won. They sat outside Delhi, they protested for a year, the government ignored them, and eventually they brought the whole thing to a standstill, and the laws have just been repealed. So the lessons that you need to keep corporate greed and that the state needs to be watchful against corporate power are as true today in India as they were in the 1850s or the 1750s. These are all things we need to be careful about. And then there's just the simple story about imperialism. Imperialism is not there to help the conquered and the ruled. It's there to enrich those who do the conquering. These are lessons that have been learnt at cost, and we must not allow our generation to see other countries ruled in this manner. I mean, at the moment, obviously, we have Putin putting his tanks today into the Ukraine. And who knows where that's going to lead? But it's it is the revival of imperialism again. There was a remarkable speech this morning in the United Nations with the Kenyan envoy, making parallels that what's happened in the colonial history of his country, and we must not allow that whole world, the whole world where a strong country can invade a weak country, to start again. And it's hard to disagree.
No, I absolutely agree. Well, the book is called The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire. It's a tour de force. It's fantastic, and it is part of four books. So there's 3 books that have been written before this. Any plans for another book or anything you got in the works?
Absolutely, but not. This company quartet is now complete, except in the United States. It's all appeared in a box set now. This is my contribution to colonial history. That's that now, and I'm enjoying doing something completely different. Nice. Not completely different, but fairly different, which is early history of India, the period when India was the a cultural imperialist in a sense, in that the whole process by which Buddhism, an Indian religion, went up to China, the way in which Hinduism and Indian dance and music and culture goes down to Southeast Asia, so that the largest Hindu temple of the world is built not in India but in Cambodia at Angkor Wat. And finally, the process by which Indian numbers go first to the Arab world and from the Arab world to Europe. And so the numbers we use today are originally Indian numerals, including 0, which was an Indian invention.
Fascinating.
Which is something that, again, because they're called Arabic numbers because Europe got them from the Arabs. Many people think they were an Arab invention, but in fact it comes from India. So it's all that package of stuff. I'm having great fun with that.
No, that sounds great. Well, look, William, it's such an absolute honor. Where can people find you? Where can they get the books and best places to look at your research?
The book is available, I hope, most places. It's certainly on Amazon, but all good bookshops. I am on Twitter @DrimpleWill, on Instagram if you want to get in touch with me or hear anything more I have to say. And I look forward to coming back for my next book.
100%. You're welcome anytime. Of course, it was such a blast. I had such a fun time talking with you about all this stuff, and so I can't say enough thanks. I really appreciate it.
You're very kind. See you again.
Okay.